Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first lesson, Your Brain, a User's Manual. I am Dr. Michael Brady, though I much prefer to be called Mike. I will begin our philosophy, ethics, and critical thinking classes in a bit of an unusual spot. I am what they call in philosophy a pragmatist. We all know the most common use of this word, and it is not far off from the specific meaning in philosophy. But it is a long academic tradition with its own history, books, philosophers, and arguments. But for now, all you need to know is that one main part of this tradition is that pragmatists take science very seriously. And I will be asking you to try out this pragmatic argument in your first lesson. You do not, I repeat, you do not have to agree, but at least listen and see what you think. Because, for pragmatists, we do not think you can even begin to understand philosophy if you ignore what science has learned about culture, psychology, and the brain. All of philosophy, all ethics, all logic, and really just everything is done by people with brains. So we all need to know a little bit about those brains before we look more deeply into what philosophy can teach us. Science will not turn out to be everything, but it is still an important part of our world. Since I teach philosophy, you may have guessed that my PhD is not in neuroscience or psychology. I'm not even a true specialist in neurophilosophy, and yes, that is a thing you can study. But what I am is an expert in the long and sometimes troubled relationship between science, philosophy, and society. If you're really bored, you can go look at my dissertation on the history of evolution and American pragmatism. So, I begin like this in the hope that you will not make the same mistakes that many, many other new philosophers have made. I've decided to break this lesson into 3 sections and present to you 3 of the best experts on your brain. These will be the 3 experts best able to help us write a brain user's manual. I've chosen them amongst many other qualified experts because they are all very well known in their field, and they have also written great, and I mean great, easy-to-read books for non-experts like you and me. You'll be able to Google any of them and find videos, podcasts, and articles if you're interested in learning a little bit more. Our first expert is Robert Sapolsky, a professor of biology and neurology at Stanford. He has a wonderful book called Behave, where he explains the complex workings of our brain and its relationship with human social behavior. Then we will jump to the psychologist Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics for his amazingly entertaining and informative book called Thinking Fast and Slow. We will then end with one of my all-time favorite philosophers, Patricia Churchland. She is a recipient of the MacArthur Genius Grant and is currently a professor at the University of California, San Diego. She was one of the founders and main popularizers of neurophilosophy, and by far the best at it, in my opinion. These 3, with a little help from me, will help you understand our brains a bit before we go deeper into philosophy, ethics, and logic in our later lessons. Before we begin, let me set some sensible limits on what we can expect from these experts on the brain. Even in our messy and often messed up world, I would suggest science is the best problem-solving method we human animals have ever come up with. But science is not, I repeat, not perfect, and it is always in a process of error correction, learning, and updating. Maybe more importantly, science is done by people, just as liable to the pitfalls, shortcuts, biases, and muddled neurobiology as you and me. Even knowing this, I would say science is our most powerful human tool, and we would be foolish to ignore what it can teach us about the world around us. So this wonderfully bearded guy is Robert Sapolsky, and that is an image of his book Behave, if you are interested. Check it out or find him on YouTube, where you could even take his full Stanford class. I did it. It's a little bit old now, but it's still pretty great. As he explains, the most useful model of our brains is currently called the triune brain. Of course, there are hundreds, maybe thousands of parts in our brains, and will be just a shorthand description for some of the most important processes. The brainstem area, in red, is largely responsible for automatic processes like breathing, heart rate, and temperature balance. These processes go on mostly below our awareness. This area is sometimes called the reptilian brain, to stress it is evolutionarily old and shared by mammals and reptiles, not to mention amphibians. As we will see in a minute, all of these processes are in constant communication and bi-directional influence with other parts of the brain. Some studies have shown when we are hungry and our regulatory system is not getting what it needs, reptilian brain, we react poorly, emotions, and even make worse decisions, neocortex. Judges will even make different decisions after lunch than they would before lunch. So, if you're ever in front of a judge and they are hangry, hungry and angry, just watch out. And these effects work in other directions as well. Most people can simply make up a scary story in their head. This happens in the neocortex. And this will trigger a troubling emotional response from the limbic system. And their breathing or heart rate will change, the reptilian part of your brain. All of this from a made-up story. So these parts of the brain are constantly in communication in both directions. The next main process in our short description is the limbic system, drawn here in purple. This is the area of the brain largely connected to emotions. Fear and social bonding take up a hefty portion of the limbic system. And with various hormones such as oxytocin, dopamine, testosterone, and estrogen, our wide range of emotions originate and emanate from this area of the brain. We will look a bit more closely at one philosophically important part of this brain, the amygdala, in a minute. But it also should be noted that essential habit formation, both positive and negative, and memory, largely take place in the limbic system. But when most of us think of the brain, they imagine this final part of the triune brain, the neocortex. The layers in this section of the brain contain most of our higher functions, such as conscious abstract thought, language, spatial reasoning, ethical foundations, and logic are also centered in this part of the brain. Even today, only a minority of philosophers will take the science of the brain seriously, though most will say they do. And as we will see when we look at the work of Daniel Kahneman and Patricia Churchland, the feeling of a rational brain most of us have is largely just a myth. There is nothing pure about our rationality. It is often driven or at least influenced by the lower sections of the brain, and this happens all the time. And something simple as a missed meal and a judge giving a bad sentence gives the lie to this idea of pure executive function. Now, this is not a neuroscience class. You might be wondering what this has to do with philosophy, ethics, or critical thinking. And believe me, I'm right there with you. But as I said at the beginning of the lesson, I am a pragmatist. So you will find me asking, why does this matter to our lived lives? A lot. And I mean a lot. The short answer is that all of us have these many unconscious sections of our brain running in the background all of the time. And everything we're doing, from the important to the boring, is affected by these brain processes. All of philosophy, political philosophy, ethics, critical thinking, and even logic is done by people with a reptilian brain wiggling away underneath the surface. And it is always there, no matter how rational you might think you are. This will be repeated again and again. Everyone is affected all the time by our environment, our temperature, our diet, our fitness level, our relationships, our everything. And most of it happens without us being aware. So let me give a specific example based on one of the most philosophically important parts of our brain, the amygdala. This tiny section of the brain, pictured in light green in the image there, does many different things. But we will talk about its importance in the fight or flight fear response. But just so you know, it is also essential for understanding how anxiety works, how social interaction and pressures work, and is part of the formation of emotionally charged memories. But this almond-shaped and named part of the brain is best known as the center of fear and aggression. And it is hard to stress enough how important this little piece of the brain is and how much it affects our behavior. But maybe the three things to keep in mind are: 1, fear and anxiety play a large role in our brains. 2, almost all of this happens without us being aware of it. Our fears and our anxieties lead us to do many things, even things we may think or know are wrong. 3. There is a built-in override in two directions. The amygdala can override the neocortex, and the neocortex with training can override the amygdala. In a true survival situation, it makes perfect sense that a human animal has a built-in, fear-based shortcut. There's no time for thinking when a mountain lion jumps out of a tree. But in a place like the United States, most of us are living in a very, very safe environment. Not everyone has a safe life, of course, but most of us are not living in a constant fight or flight existence. But over the years, hundreds of students have told me that they are more afraid now because the country is so scary, even though the crime rate is a fraction of what it was in the 1990s, much less the 1970s. And in large-scale polls, everyone says the same thing as the students. But this evidence does not support this view, even a little bit. It's just simply wrong. But ask citizens, politicians, or police officers, and they will almost all say that we live in a much more scary world. Even worse, there are many studies that show whoever you happen to think the other is, based on nationality, skin color, economic cues, or whatever, will trigger the fear and anxiety of your brain, the amygdala. And this fear will shortcut your neocortex. That we hope should know better, but often doesn't. And all of this happens without us being aware almost all the time. This is why we all need to know about these underlying effects on our lived experience. I know that we have just covered a lot of sciencey stuff, but we will now be moving up a level from biology and neurology into larger scale behaviors like biases, and eventually we'll move on to ethics. These large-scale areas are a traditional space of study for philosophy. Every philosophy professor has trained in this area at least a little bit. These biases, informal fallacies, and their effects on ethics, logic, and philosophy have been studied for thousands of years, from 300 BC at least, in places like Greece, China, and India. But we will be using the ideas and focus of Daniel Kahneman in his very famous and massively influential book from a few years ago called Thinking Fast and Slow. If you take the many smaller processes of the triune brain and look at how they play out in our everyday behavior, this is Kahneman's book. He argues that a useful way to model these many processes, like the reptilian brain, limbic region, and neocortex, is to separate them into two overlapping systems. Like his book title, he calls these two systems thinking fast and thinking slow. The first system is thinking fast. These are the largely unconscious, automatic, emotional shortcuts, sometimes called heuristics. They are the older structures of human brains, and we share them with many other animals. They are also essential for our survival, especially in our ancient past. Remember our example. There is no time for thinking when the mountain lion hops out of the tree. And on their own they can be useful, but sometimes this speed is troubling or just plain wrong. These shortcuts are sometimes based on bad information, poor risk assessment, or provoke reactions against people because they look or act differently than we are used to. We often call these instincts, gut feelings, emotional reactions. And in certain limited cases, they are useful and important, but they can and do go wrong. While System 1 is fast, System 2 is thinking slow. It is deliberate, rational, and measured. Much of our modern world is built on the use of the wonders that rise out of this type of thinking. Mathematics, logic, and science are built on the foundation of this slow System 2 thinking. If you have gone to school for 12 years or more, or 20, like me, you have been training in this type of thinking your whole life. It can be good, amazing even. A vaccine built on a rather new mRNA technology was developed and distribution began in about a year. And they actually formulated the vaccine itself in less than a week. But System 2 slow thinking is not all good. Many horrible technologies, like chemical weapons, were also developed on very similar technologies. So, what made Kahneman's book so influential and so important was two things. System one, the fast thinking part of our brain, always comes first. These shortcuts, emotions, and impulses are just an inseparable part of humanity. Even if someone wanted to be purely logical, it is not really possible with our current biology. It is just this point that drives home the need for this introduction when beginning any form of philosophy, ethics, or critical thinking class. We need to approach these subjects knowing just how difficult it will be to actually do them. 2. Kahneman also stresses something we saw earlier in the lesson. System 1 thinking, fast thinking, can easily override System 2 slow thinking. But under certain circumstances, the slower, more deliberate parts of our brain can also lessen the effects of these underlying shortcuts and biases. And this is exactly what this class is about, the type of practice and training to reduce the effects of unconscious bias. Before moving on to the next highest level with Patricia Churchland, let me briefly say why this matters. Whatever we do, buying a house, voting, food choices, raising children, religion, no religion, fashion, hobbies, whatever it is, everything, everyone is always affected by this common human biology. It is just a simple fact of life. The truth is that we humans are predictably irrational. The title of another great book on this topic, if you'd like to check it out. Humans are full of biases. We are really bad at probability, and we really often misjudge risk. All of this would not be a huge problem, and this class would probably not exist if people would just admit we are often wrong and work to fix it the best that we can. But this rarely happens. And at this point, there is a lot of evidence for specific failures like confirmation bias, status quo bias, good old time bias, and many others that make this class necessary. We've gone from the level of biology and neurology to the larger, fast, and slow thinking processes of the brain. We will now go up another connected level and look at what it means to do abstract stuff, like philosophy, ethics, or critical thinking while taking the neuroscience and psychological science seriously. Our expert for this final section is Patricia Churchland, and her original book on this topic was called Brainwise, but her wonderful recent book is called Conscience. After teaching about these ideas many times, let me get one common reaction to all of this science stuff out of the way. The science is not, and probably never will tell us what we should do in a specific ethical or philosophical situation. Human culture is exceedingly complex, and it is embedded in and reliant on an equally complicated environment. Let me give a quick local example of this complexity. Many poor areas of the U.S. still have lead pipes. Chicago might be the worst city in the country for this problem. And we know that the tiniest parts per million bit of lead in your water as a child will probably lower your future intelligence, weaken your ability to make difficult decisions, and may and often does lead to behavioral problems. But later on, we as a society will often harshly judge this person, both ethically and legally, when they act out in school or commit a crime when they are older. But no one thinks a kid being exposed to lead is that kid's fault. However, we still will judge and imprison them later with little thought to the partial cause of this later issue. So this is the type of complex human, cultural, environmental, ethical issue that Churchland will address. She wants us to take what we are learning about the brain and look back to ancient thinkers like Aristotle or Enlightenment thinkers like David Hume. Aristotle and Hume centered their ethical philosophy on the idea that we humans are social animals, as some of you will get to learn about. And she wants us to combine this ancient stuff with our growing knowledge about brains and the main hormones, oxytocin, dopamine, estrogen, and testosterone. And what we will have when we combine this human wisdom and our best science is a caring structure based in human psychology. And it will focus on embedded problem solving and learning from our best and worst social practices to make a better world. So for this shorter, final level, why does it matter? It matters because we have learned so much about brains, psychology, and social science that it is almost absurd to ignore it. Many difficult cultural legal issues, like our example about the effects of lead on children, are informed by what we have learned about how lead affects young brains and how these effects play out, usually badly, over time. Without this science, we might never know why poor areas with high lead levels are so different from other areas. We might blame the wrong person or fix the wrong problems and never really know the truth. Also, the complexity of mixing in many fields of science hints that there will probably never be a simple, easy answer. This might be a bit unsatisfying to some people who want an easy moral tale, but the complexity better explains the actual world where we live, where easy solutions are so rare. The answers will only come from a broader and deeper understanding of all the factors: neurological, psychological, and philosophical. This has been a very short and very quick guide to some complex science and psychology. There are 5 main things to take away from this lesson to use for the rest of the class. 1. A long history of both biological and cultural evolution is sitting inside your head right now, and you should do your best to learn a little bit about it. 2. Somewhere in the range of 70 to 95%, depending on whose math you use, of all the processes in the brain are subconscious. Most of our emotional responses, mental shortcuts, biases, and the general operations of our brain are happening below our awareness. But these subconscious processes have a huge effect on us and on the world. Everyone is affected all the time. There are no exceptions to this biology. And this is the reason to take classes like this, where you can learn about the brain and learn some tactics to overcome these built-in limitations. 3. I cannot stress enough how almost all the science points to the importance of a good childhood, of good social bonds, good diet, safe environment, and proper education. We could literally change the world if we took childhood more seriously, and we really do not for everyone. 4. Learning about the many shortcuts and biases we are prone to, will make you not only a better decision maker, but also, I would say, a better person. And 5. Never forget how complex all of this is. Stay humble and be willing to admit error, and we can learn about this stuff together.